Today I want to talk about the themes that inspired Broadband Service Provider and the ever-recurring theme of comedy of helplessness. A lot of modern films in recent history have dealt with the same central question, and that is, what happens to a person when the system they're in becomes so large that they're unable to influence anything within them? And what happens to those individuals when they feel like just another cog in the machine? Over the last few years, we've created these antagonists, these villains in our stories that represent the modern corporate world and the detached unfeelingness it has towards all of us. We have call centers, mega corporations, cement buildings, endless policy scripts as just a small number of villains we see throughout various different films. These are our modern mythological beasts. And how does an ordinary human being feel within these systems? And how does he or she respond? Well, today I want to look at 3 distinct films that influenced Broadband Service Provider and how Broadband Service Provider took these themes to another level.
No, I already did that, and you told me I have to wait 30 days. I need it cancelled now.
I want to take a look at Death of a Telemarketer, a film about corporate greed and revenge. Sorry to Bother You, a film that explores the surreal machine of capitalism. And finally, About Schmidt, which is just a quiet tragedy of insignificance in the face of these huge cement block machines. And Broadband Service Provider enters this discussion in the lineage of cinema, exploring a deeply human meltdown disguised as a customer service dispute. Something that all of these films have in common is the setting, specifically setting up the machine, a machine of corporate greed, of carelessness, and insignificance. And in different movies, this takes various different formats through different people, different buildings, different relationships. And often, the corporate helplessness is started with a small gatekeeper who embodies the machine as a whole. In a lot of the times, it's the lowly receptionist who, in their careless, blasé attitude, shows just what the machine is as a whole, and essentially what our protagonists are striving against. In The Death of a Telemarketer, we have the receptionist, a person who has total apathy, no interest in the human being at all. It's essentially an avatar of the company policy. It's not a person. The essence of these characters is specifically to not have any internal conflict within them, but show a blank slate, a concrete wall of the building towards the audience, and be a stark contrast to our protagonist.
Check out the front row.
Just like in Broadband Service Provider, this mirrors our receptionist, a person who aimlessly scrolls Instagram and not really bothers to care about what's happening in the office. She's just there to follow business as usual and get her check and leave. In a similar fashion, there's other methods that films use to expose this corporate structure.
Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave these premises.
In Sorry to Bother You, we see the telemarketing floor drenched in cold corporate blue, and Cassius is the only warm yellow in the sea of blue, our protagonist who still has some humanity left within him, but who's unwittingly joining this sea of uncaring. He's just a tiny spark who's being swallowed by a system that's too large for him to handle. In a similar fashion in Broadband Service Provider, we see Jake, who just wants to have a normal human conversation with the receptionist, not be allowed to have any human interaction with her, but be asked to leave at the first sign of trouble.
Sir, you're not supposed to go down there.
Finally, About Schmidt has possibly one of the most iconic intro sequences in all of film history, setting up the corporate machine as a cold, uncaring, cement block building that he sits in alone, depressed, until the final hour of the workday, when he's able to leave for home. We see this huge monolith of a building, and the shots specifically frame him to look like an insignificant figure within them. And from the very first frame that we see Schmidt in, we can already tell that he's a man defeated. He's a man who spent too many years in the system, and his fight has already been lost before we even enter the film. Following this fashion, we tried to set, in Broadband Service Provider, the reception area as a battleground where humanity finally loses and all personality is stripped away from people before they're able to enter the corporate world. We use such elements as the locked door, the fob, the receptionist who refuses to speak to Jake. All of these elements introduce the idea of helplessness, even before the plot has had a chance to start. And I think the humor in these films comes from the absurd mismatch between humanity and these corporate worlds. And watching these films as an inspiration for a broadband service provider, a fascinating thing that I found was that in a lot of the cases, kidnapping is the extreme act that protagonists resort to sort of claim back some sort of autonomy over their actions, some sort of influence. And what is specifically fascinating about that is that instead of attacking the companies or the systems directly head on, they choose to exert extreme actions over other individuals who are just like them, trapped in a system. And a lot of these films act almost like pressure cookers. When systems deny agency long enough to the main characters, they finally leap to extreme actions, with the main goal for these protagonists being to reclaim agency over their own lives. But even in such extreme acts, the corporate structure and system still peep through in the most uncanny ways.
Looking for this?
For example, in Death of a Telemarketer, everything is still a sale. Even when our main protagonist is kidnapped, he still tries to sell to the kidnapper. He's still trying to pitch something because really that's the only identity that he knows.
Let's just call it even and go our separate ways.
Just like in our film, even though Michael is kidnapped by Jake, he still uses this opportunity to try to upsell the broadband service. In Sorry to Bother You, the group decide to stand up to the telemarketing company as a whole, but even so, they find that the corporation is bigger than their individual goals, and Cassius decides to become a power caller just to earn some extra money, convincing himself that he's not really betraying his fellow men.
Fuck them!
Yes.
Finally, in About Schmidt, Warren Schmidt allows himself to, in a metaphorical way, kidnap himself in the only way he knows how to, in his letters to Ndugu. This is the only safe space that he has to express what he really feels about his wife, about his work, about how they easily replaced him. In this film specifically, the seizure and the kidnapping is very symbolic, and only expressed through these letters that he and Ndugu alone share.
I can't believe it's really me.
In our film specifically, this kidnapping is both ridiculous, but also painfully human at the same time. It feels to Jake like an act of rebellion, but all it does is reveal how little power he actually has himself. By following through with the kidnapping, trying to escape the script that he was locked in for ages with a customer service representative, he unwittingly locks himself in to another script. And all four films just go to show that this extreme act of kidnapping does very little to change their actual circumstances within the film. In all of these films also, we see how corporate structures have an influence over different characters in the way they behave inside these structures. Some characters specifically rebel against these structures and try to preserve their own humanity, while others accept these systems and try to model their behavior around what is expected of them. A great example in Death of a Telemarketer, we have the security guard, a person who is supposed to represent a serious job, but in the sense of corporate uncaring, he decides to preserve his own humanity and to really care about what he cares about as an individual.
I am beautiful. I am kind. I am smart.
In Sorry to Bother You, what's interesting is that at the beginning of the film, Cassius feels out of place, even before he's accepted by this corporate world. And so he tries to fit in. But even through his best attempts to fit in, he doesn't feel himself in the corporate world. So he decides to rebel. And here we have an example of somebody who doesn't fit in inside or outside the system. And here more so, the argument is that capitalism as a whole creates these boxes that no one individual can cleanly fit into. It's a bit of a larger argument, but it still relates to the same idea that you're either inside or outside of the machine. Finally, in About Schmidt, what's interesting is that Warren Schmidt not only gets trapped in this system at work, but also in his marriage as well. He is just a helpless man who things happen to. He doesn't have a lot of autonomy at work, and he doesn't have a lot of autonomy at home either. At work, all of his decisions are made by his superiors, and at home, all of his decisions are made by his wife. So this is a man who has struggled for many years to suppress what he really feels himself, just to fit in all of these scenarios and appease all these people. And this emotional helplessness is the undercurrent of the entire film. And this helplessness, specifically, is what eventually forces Warren Schmidt to take action against his as he sees pathetic life. In the broadband service provider confrontation, Jake specifically embodies this human quality of trying to remove himself from this corporate world and not wanting anything to do with this system, this machine. In contrast, Michael, even when confronted with this extreme scenario, he still resorts to the system, to the things he understands and he trusts. Instead of humanizing him and relating to him, he uses this opportunity to try to upsell the service that he's providing.
Are they offering you a better deal? Can we try and match it?
I don't want a better deal. I don't want anything from you.
What further fascinated me about all these films and broadband service provider as well is that in all of these cases, the protagonist chose to attack something seemingly quite insignificant, attaching all of their hate and all of their pent-up dissatisfaction and aggression towards this one thing that they can seemingly fix. So Schmidt, having lost his wife, having lost his job, and not knowing what to do with this energy, finds love letters, 30 years old love letters between his deceased wife and one of his best friends. And taking all of this pent-up aggression, he decides to take it out on him as the sole source of all of his problems. Now, of course, after this outburst, it doesn't fix anything, it doesn't change anything for him. He is forced to reflect further and further understand what is making him so unhappy. In Sorry to Bother You, Cassius decides to forsake his brothers and his immediate circle of other telemarketers, blaming them for not being good enough to excel in this corporate world, to really make something of themselves. In this way, fooling himself that really the only reason why he's successful and he's becoming a power caller is because others are not good enough and they are in denial. In this way, he gets a quick satisfaction out of this action, but in the long term, he puts himself on the road to failure.
But I'm ready.
In our film, Jake decides to find Michael, the customer service representative, and confront him at his work as a way to reclaim his life. This one seemingly futile and meaningless act will solve all of his problems. And of course, just like the previous films suggest, these small actions don't really solve anything for the main characters. In a similar way, Jake does not manage to solve anything by the end of this confrontation. In fact, he just ends up paying more for his service.
I don't love you.
I'm with a client!
Think she heard me?
I would say the unifying thread between all of these films is that at a certain point, all of these characters are pushed to make a radical choice, a radical change in their life. But even at the end of all of that, after all of their sacrifices, we see that nothing in their world has changed, nothing in their circumstances has changed. They all come back to the same life that they knew before, which begs us to ask, what was it for anyway? In Sorry to Bother You, Cassius resists the temptation of $100 million and still chooses his girlfriend, his life, his humanity. He chooses all of this over corporate ascension. And yet, at the very end of the film, he's back living in his garage in his uncle's house, maybe with a few extra new lamps and some better wallpaper on the walls, but nothing radically changes about his life. In a similar fashion, Warren Schmidt finally takes a stand. He tries to do what he thought was the right thing. He confronts his daughter and tells her not to marry her husband-to-be. And through all of this, he still fails. He admits at the end of the film that he's a failure and he has managed to affect no change in the world. And he says that he's going to die either today or in 20 years, and it will not matter at all. Finally, in Death of a Telemarketer, even as our main character is kidnapped and threatened and held at gunpoint, at the end of the day, even after there's a lot of violence and rebellion, nothing really changes. The company comes back to functioning just like it did, and our main character comes back to working just like he did as a telemarketer, proving once again that these acts of rebellion don't really influence the systems that these characters are within. Finally, in our film, the crescendo is that Jake's radical act ends in a negotiation for a slightly faster broadband plan. He doesn't change the system, he doesn't manage to fix his relationship with his wife, he doesn't manage to get more control over his life, but this small win appeases him just for a second to feel like he has some semblance of control over his own life. So to close this discussion, broadband service provider is fixed firmly in this lineage of films that specifically target corporate worlds and these cement unfeeling systems as the main antagonist of our modern world. They explore individual agency within these growing systems and question whether we really have any control over what we do and what happens to us in this new world that we live in. Finally, what I think is most important in all of these films, and broadband service provider as well, is that in all of them, the characters confuse small victories for a victory over the main thing that caused them grief and anguish. And it beckons to question whether these small appeasements are just a way that the system has designed to actively correct itself and correct these small insurgencies that happen within it. And so, as a final thought of this film, I leave you with this question. Do we really have any control over what we do anymore in our lives? Or is it all just predetermined by the systems that we live within? And do seemingly cathartic acts that individually show a semblance of autonomy have any bearing over the larger system? This has been Mad Potato Studios. Thanks for listening.
I just wish I had the space and time to do my own thing.